Hello and welcome back to the Take 3 Theological Variety Hour. My name is Christine Chase. I'm here with my co-hosts Erica Sakuchi and Seth Alexander. And today we are talking mostly about Thomas Aquinas, but also some of his contemporaries, Erica and Seth, because they know Thomas Aquinas and the Summa Theologica better than I do. They'll be addressing that. I'm going to actually start us off this week talking about one of my favorite saints. This is a saint I didn't even know about until maybe college, probably after college, and I'm still stunned that I didn't learn about him at all in CCD or any of my years in Catholic schools, because he is, at least in my mind, if you were going to rank the absolute coolest saints to ever be recognized by the church, he would definitely be in the top 10. So the saint I'm talking about is the teacher of Thomas Aquinas, and that is Saint Albertus Magnus. This guy, he studied everything. He wrote about everything. He ended up having major cultural contributions, and the legends about him are just fascinating. So Albertus Magnus was born around 1200. They're not entirely sure. They think it was maybe 1193, but generally they say he was born circa 1200 in Bavaria. And his patronage, we'll hit this first and then we'll talk about his life some. He is the patron of Cincinnati, Ohio. I don't know why Cincinnati. That is something I will be looking into, because of all places, weird. I would not have thought Cincinnati. Also, medical technicians, natural scientists, philosophers, scientists, students, World Youth Day, and I can also tell you, even though this isn't officially listed, he is considered by alchemists to be their patron saint as well. So he was, imagine, if you will, your classic Victorian era, or you might even say steampunk style mad scientist. That character. Then place him in the 13th century and he's a good guy. That's Albertus Magnus. That's who he was. There's a legend that he was actually stupid when he was a young fella, but we do know that he writes that he had a vision or encounter with the Blessed Virgin Mary, who convinced him to enter holy orders. And the legend says that during this encounter, she also, made an arrangement with the Holy Spirit, and he was blessed with just incredible intelligence and intellectual ability. So he goes and he entered into the Dominican order sometime between 1223 and 1229. The accounts vary on that. And then he starts studying. He studied and starts writing. And then it was in 1245 that he becomes a master of theology. He was the first German Dominican to do this. And after he attained at that level, he was able to teach at the University of Paris as a full-time professor, where he held the chair of theology at the College of St. James. And it was at this time that Thomas Aquinas began to study under him. One of the things that he's noted for is Albert was the first to comment on virtually all of the writings of Aristotle, making them therefore accessible to wider academic debate. And his study of Aristotle also brought him to study and comment on the teachings of notable Muslim academics, particularly Avicenna and Averroes. So he was, when you're talking about bringing Aristotle into the greater Western culture outside of, Greece, and bringing him back after the fall of the Roman Empire, Albert was the reason this happened. A lot of times you'll see this offhand mention that, it was, various monks who managed to preserve the writings of the philosophers through the quote Dark Ages, or through the fall of the Roman Empire. Albert was the guy who really set the comebacks, particularly for Aristotle. And his study of Aristotle really influenced his scientific and philosophical views. In 1899, all of his writings were compiled, and it took 38 volumes for everything he wrote to be accounted for. And he wrote on things such as logic, theology, botany, geography, astronomy, astrology, mineralogy, alchemy, zoology, physiology, phrenology, justice, law, friendship, and love. And that's not everything. That's just some of the high points for him. He was the first person to really digest, interpret, and systemize the entirety of Aristotle's works. He got that from the Latin translations, but also he gleaned a lot from the Arabian and Muslim commentators. So pretty much all of our modern knowledge of Aristotle comes through Albert at some point. All of, you trace all of everything back. He's sort of the bottleneck because he's the one who brings it back out. His knowledge of physical science was considerable and very accurate, they say, for the age. He was very systematic. He touched a lot of everything. Though there are some gaps because even someone who was heralded by his contemporaries as the Doctor Universalis, I mean, there's always going to be a few gaps, but an exception to his sort of general study, his focus, I don't want to say focus on general studies, but I think you know what I mean. He actually wrote a treatise called De Falcanibus. Sorry, Latin is not working today for me. And that ends up becoming part of De Animabilis. And he just goes into all the birds of prey, the different kinds of falcons, how to prepare them for hunt, to use them in falconry, how to cure sick and wounded falcons. So apparently this guy, Albertus, really knew his birds of prey and really wanted to share that knowledge. In De Minerabilis, he claims that the aim of natural philosophy, which we would today call science, is not simply to accept the statements of others, but to investigate the causes that are at work in nature. This is, again, heavily influenced by Aristotle. And he actually, he later on, when he was talking in his treatise on plants, he begins with the principle that experiment is the only safe guide in your investigations. So in many ways, I've seen him credited as being one of the first fathers of the Western civilization scientific method tradition that he talks about. No, you have to experiment. You can't just take it on words of others. You can't just look and observe. You also have to run experiments. On the other hand, he also really respected authority and tradition so much that he never published many of his investigations and experiments. And he kept silent about many of the things that he investigated in astronomy and physics because he felt that his theories were too advanced for the time in which he was living, which, of course, sparks my curiosity because as soon as I see that, I just really want to know what he was working on that he felt he couldn't share because this is beyond all of you, which again goes back to the whole think about the Victorian mad scientist. That's exactly what they might say. There's a tradition that he was an, quote, alchemist and magician. A lot of this comes because there were a lot of later, in the Renaissance and after, there were a lot of magical and alchemical treatises that were written under his name, but weren't really him. They were just attributed to him. However, he did actually himself write on this alchemy in his commentary on Aristotle about minerals. He refers to the power of stones, but doesn't really elaborate on what those are. But through his alchemical studies, he is credited with the discovery of the element arsenic, and he experimented with photosensitive chemicals, including silver nitrate. That is the beginning of photography right there. It really wasn't photography in the way that we knew it, But I don't, if you were ever a kid, sometimes you would get in science kits where you would have something like silver nitrate and you would like put a leaf on it and put it out into the sun and then bring it back into the shade, and then you'd have an image of the leaf on the silver. That's what he was doing. It was the very, very first steps into photography. Legend says that Albert discovered the Philosopher's Stone and passed it on to Thomas Aquinas shortly before his death. Albert never actually writes about this, but he did record that he witnessed the creation of gold by transmutation. So he may have seen something like that, but the whole Philosopher's Stone thing is unlikely, because if he had, Thomas wouldn't have died right after that. So it seems unlikely. But I've actually studied some alchemy. The Philosopher's Stone is not necessarily an object. It's not necessarily a thing. And the eternal life it gives is not necessarily the physical. We can maybe talk about that in a later episode. Now, he did write the little book of alchemy, which, Seth, I believe you were the one who got me my copy of that. You found it and sent it to me, and I was so happy to get it. But in that, he talks about alchemic gold and iron lacking the properties of natural gold and iron, alchemical iron being non-magnetic, and alchemical gold turning to powder after several ignitions. And my interpretation of that is that he's actually talking about monatomic gold, which is something that was really sort of discovered and started getting experimented with in the past couple of centuries. But I suspect he was one of the first people to start creating it, at least in the modern era. There is some evidence that the Egyptians knew of it. So there's that. He did also write on astrology. The medieval, and I would say the Albertian understanding of astrology is very different than what we think of it today when we talk about, what's your horoscope? You're born under a certain sign and therefore you're fated to a certain type of life. Whereas the medieval and the Albert view was that the laws that govern the motion of the planets are the same laws that govern the general generic fate of humankind. And that because of that, there's a correlation. It's not causation, but it is correlation. And so that by observing the motions of the planets and learning them, you can get some idea of what's going on with that higher law that governs everything below. So it's really interesting. It's not an astrology that negates free will. It's an astrology that's more trying to understand some almost a higher mathematics. He also studied music and wrote about proportions of music and what playing chants is good for in terms of psychological health. But he also paid a lot of attention to silence as an integral part of music. And this is something that later on is noted by Claude Debussy and Miles Davis when they say that music is really more the space between the notes than the notes itself. I mean, he wrote a ton of other things. He wrote on morals, which I'm sure that's why Erica knows about him, talking about the metaphysics of morals. He writes on natural law. He writes on friendship and just how it is a moral good. There's also some interesting legends. There's a story that he actually had a robot servant that he named Android, and he would talk and this thing would answer. And apparently it could walk and talk on its own, but they say that Thomas Aquinas smashed it to bits with a hammer because it kept interrupting his thought process. So apparently, I sort of imagine this as the difference between, if you think of the Avengers, Tony Stark and JARVIS, and they'll go back and forth, and Tony Stark will ask his artificial intelligence, JARVIS, something, or he'll just be, riffing on an idea, and JARVIS will interject, and there'll be this byplay. But Brice Banner doesn't work that way. He doesn't think that way. And if JARVIS were to try to interrupt him too many times, he might turn green and Hulk out and smash Jarvis to bits. So there's that story that he actually had a robot butler, and that sort of, or not even butler, but like thinking companion, which again goes into that whole Victorian steampunk mad scientist idea. And when I'm using this idea of the Victorian mad scientist, I'm not just pulling it out of my sleeve because I love steampunk stories. It's also because he is one of the characters. Mary Shelley references him and says that he was an inspiration for the character of Dr. Frankenstein. And in fact, in Frankenstein, Mary Shelley, when she's describing the sort of the library and the writings that young Victor Frankenstein was reading, mentions Albert along with Agrippa and Paracelsus. So yeah, totally Victorian mad scientist centuries before the Victorian era. Dante also mentions him with Thomas Aquinas as being lovers of wisdom in the heaven of the sun. I'm sure if Seth ever wanted to elaborate on that, he could, since he was a fan of Dante. So this guy he's just great stories about him culturally as being sort of the renewer of Aristotle in the Western canon, really setting a lot of the ground for the later scientific tradition. Immensely important to Western civilization. Fascinating guy. And I never learned about him until I started studying alchemy, which is a shame. I may have seen him mentioned once or twice, and I was like, oh, like Gregor Mendel, another scientist monk. But no, he was super influential, incredibly fascinating. I wish I'd learned about him in high school or in any of my years of CCD instead of learning for the 5th time about St. Francis, which I got no problem with St. Francis. He's great, but how many times do I got to be introduced to the guy? So that is Albertus Magnus. He was the teacher of St. Thomas Aquinas. So if you can imagine being this guy's student, being his like primary student, the one that he shares everything with and really sort of takes under his wing, that's who Thomas Aquinas was. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to Seth and Erica, and they'll talk about Thomas and his Summa Theologica.
Cool. Thank you, Christine. Thanks for taking us through Albertus Magnus. I would say, don't feel bad that you didn't learn about him until later, because honestly, being in theology classes, we didn't talk about Albertus Magnus a lot either. I'm sure people specialize in him, but like in our general studies, he's not someone we read. And I actually never thought of him as being within that kind of first generation of Western thinkers who started to engage with Aristotle. I think of people like Alexander of Hales and people like that, but Albertus Magnus never really was someone that we spent a lot of time on. So that was cool to know his role in that. And of course, we know him as the teacher of Thomas Aquinas, and Thomas Aquinas, is just such a large looming figure in Catholic theology that, of course, his teacher must have been pretty rad. But yeah, I don't know. That was cool. So Erica and I have spent a lot of time with Thomas, enough time to where I feel comfortable making fat jokes about him, because there's the story that he was enormously fat, which I don't know if that's true. I think
I've heard that that's a myth. I'm just going to interject.
I think it's polemical. I think you're right.
I've heard that in truth he was actually like jacked, because there's a legend. Probably. There's some story about him. He was like on a riverboat, and the sailors had to break up the oars. I guess they were going upstream, and they couldn't manage to get the boat going up. So he gets off the boat like with a rope and starts pulling and towing it up the river. And of course, he walked all over friggin' Europe all the time. Right. So
exactly.
It, between that and the story that he's just pulling boats that sailors, never men known for being, weak or pushovers. So I think maybe that, Thomas was big. He was a big guy. maybe just got morphed over the centuries from being like stacked to being a blubberous.
Being stacked with pancakes.
Yeah.
But Thomas is responsible. So, Erica and I have spent so much time with Thomas that I feel like we probably say some things offhandedly about him. So just for our listeners, if they haven't, engaged with Thomas a bit, he is the author of a text called the Summa Theologica or Summa Theologica, which is an enormous work that he worked on for, much of his life. And actually he died before it was finished. What the Summa is basically, if you look at the Summa now, it's very daunting. This text was actually written as kind of an introduction to theology for Dominican, young Dominicans. And reading it now, you're just sort of like, oh my gosh, because there's a lot in there. And how it's structured kind of in a medieval argumentation type of way. So what Thomas will do, like if you pick up the Summa, what you're going to see is questions and then articles. So Thomas will have a question, and then he'll break it down into articles. So break it down into smaller bits. And in those articles, the first part of the article you'll see is the objections. So what does that mean? Thomas lays out the counter position to the one he's going to take ultimately. And he relies on different, classical authors, theologians, biblical texts. So he's using authorities and he's laying out these objections, which is kind of on the model of Peter Abelard, who wrote Sic et Non, which kind of just laid out all these differing views that, were sometimes mutually exclusive.
I kind of feel like he was like luring you though, like when you first start to read this, he presents a position. He's like, oh, doesn't this make sense? Isn't this great? And then he's like, no, wrong.
Exactly.
Wrong. And then you're like, oh man.
Yeah, sometimes you'll read through the Summa and you'll be like, this sounds really good. You're like, how can he disagree with this? And then he ultimately does. Although sometimes Thomas's disagree. I mean, sometimes Thomas kind of phones it in. There's a few articles where it's sort of like, okay, Thomas.
But that sounds like wonderfully like ordered and systemic. Like, here's the thing. Here's what all these other guys say. Here's why they're wrong. And it's like every time it's the same structure.
It's beautiful. He was like sitting at home with his cat because he was a cat person, and he was just talking to himself. That's all. I think he was going through this, and he's like, no, it couldn't be that, so it has to be this. And then he writes his next point. No, it couldn't be that. It has to be this. And this is the life of Thomas Aquinas with his cat, the grumpy cat.
Well, Thomas also had a lot of people working with him to, take his dictation because he had really terrible handwriting. So after the objections, you'll get what's called the sed contra. So Thomas will cite another authority that gives kind of a counter position to the objections that he's just laid out. Then he will finally, in the middle, after the sed contra, he will give his answer to whatever the question is. And then after the answer, he will give replies, detailed replies to the objections that he laid out at the beginning of the article. So that is just very fast and loose way that the Summa is structured. And when I was thinking about what I wanted to do with Thomas, like with many things we cover on this podcast, we could spend a lot of time on Thomas. But one thing that I wanted to bring up, similar to what we've talked about before, is the idea of language about God. So in one of our past episodes, we talked about the apophatic versus the cataphatic, and kind of the theologian par excellence who talks about that is Pseudo-Dionysius. Pseudo-Dionysius is actually, I believe, the second most cited theologian, if I'm remembering correctly. He's the second most cited after Augustine theologian in the Summa Theologica. So Thomas definitely knew Pseudo-Dionysius and relied a lot upon his works. Pseudo-Dionysius puts forward this apophatic idea about God, so that all language that we have about God fails because God is so transcendent and far above us. But what Thomas says, he agrees with Pseudo-Dionysius to a degree, but he also really lays out something that's fundamental for theology, which is the idea of the language of analogy. So whereas Pseudo-Dionysius will say that, all language kind of falls short of describing the essence of God, Thomas will say that yes, but also our language about God can give us some idea about what God is, and that is by analogy. So kind of the idea of something being univocal, meaning that it would mean the same thing. So if we say God is good, then our understanding of good is the exact same as the way we're saying it about God. Versus univocal or equivocal, which would be saying if we say God is good, the meaning of good is completely different than, our understanding of good is completely different of the way God is good. The language of analogy is saying that when we say God is good, that goodness that we signify with that word is proportionate insofar as we understand as, material human beings. It is proportionate to the way that God is good, but God is kind of the ground and fountain of all goodness. So our understanding of good is much less than the goodness that God in God's essence is. So if that makes sense at all. The way that this really lays the groundwork for theologians is that because our language and because we as human beings are kind of fumbling towards talking about these, divine realities, we have to use language from all over the place. And that's really the basis of this podcast, is that we have to, as my dissertation director, Mark McIntosh, said, we have to pirate language. We have to hijack language. So when you're doing theology, you don't just sit, in a room and read the Bible, which is definitely not what Thomas did either. You have to look at, the things out in the world and use those things to better understand the ultimate reality. So on this podcast, we're looking at pop culture, we're looking at, literature, we're looking at films, to hijack that language and make it, sensible in a discussion about God. Thomas is not the first person to do theology, of course. He's writing in the 13th century, but the way he writes about theology really is a watershed moment for theology. I think whether you're Catholic or Protestant, I really think that you have some kind of indebtedness to Thomas. And there's a reaction later, particularly in the Reformation, against this kind of scholastic theology that he's doing. But I don't think there is a reaction against the way in which he's doing it. The language of analogy is just part of the way we do theology. And I think if you think of your language about the divine as anything other than analogy, then you might be treading in some dangerous territory. Yeah. There was one other thing I was going to say, but I totally forgot what it was. Erica, what do you have for us about Thomas?
So my piece of Thomas, I'm the ethicist, right? I'm the people person. So the part of Thomas that I've read the most, because honestly, I consider myself an Aquinas scholar just because of the sheer amount of time, of amazing time that I have spent. The gray hairs they're not gray, they're silver. I'm Italian. The beautiful silver hairs on my curly head that have been dedicated to reading through Aquinas. But I have to say that I have read the first part. Thomas's Summa is broken into parts, and there's like the first part, and then there's the second part of the first part, and then there's the second part of the second part, and the third part of the second part, and then there's a third part that never got finished. So anyways, the time that I have spent the most on is the part about law, because when we talk about Thomas and law, we start to get into not so much what he says about the soul, not so much what he says about Jesus or the sacraments, but we get into why God's law, and why, okay, first of all, why there is a divine law, and how that trickles down and how we ought to act and respond to God's law. So I'm just going to take you through some of the basics, like the really basics when Thomas talks about laws, because this, for me, is kind of frustrating in talking to people that think they know Aquinas but actually don't know Aquinas, because they've only read what other people have said about Aquinas much, much later. And a lot of it, honestly, was misappropriated and continues to be misappropriated, which is very frustrating, because I think Aquinas has something really pure and a really good basic guideline for dealing with how we ought to act. So he has four main kinds of law. He has the eternal law, the natural law, the human law, and the divine law. So I'm going to quickly go through the other three of the types of law, and then we're going to focus on the problematic law, which is the natural law. So eternal law is kind of identical to the mind of God as seen as God himself, right? So when we start talking about God, God is outside of time, and God is time, and God is before time, and God is the creator of time. God works with time in such a way that it is unimaginable for us to actually understand God's essence and in and of time. Humans are time related, but God is not. So it can be called law because God stands apart from the universe that he creates as a ruler. And it is the promulgation of his eternal will. So think of it as God is unchanging, and so therefore there is an eternal law that rules the universe and always will. Divine law. Now you would say, oh, okay, but God is divine, so how does that make sense, Professor? Yeah, I used to hear that all the time. So divine law is a little bit different because it comes from the eternal law. If you think about it, if I it's like between action and inaction. If I'm sitting here, I just am. I'm just a being. I simply exist. But if I go to do something that I'm thinking about and I act on something, that's different than just my being of existing. Then I'm acting. So divine law is almost, you could relate it to God acting throughout human history. So the Bible, right? We have a divine law in the Bible, the covenant of the Old Testament, the covenant of the New Testament, and how does God act within our history. So then we have human law, and I purposely skipped over natural law because it's the problem. Okay, so human law. Thomas's philosophy says, indebted very much to Aristotle, that we have a sense of something called teleology. And that simply means we are always acting towards a purpose. So we're never without purpose. Humans are not purposeless creatures. It's almost impossible for us to be purposeless. You may not know why you're acting, but you are acting for a reason. And if you sat down and thought of it, whether it's a good or bad reason, like maybe, you rob a store because you're like, I'm a robber. I just want to rob a store. But really you want Cheetos. Well, why do you want the Cheetos? You want the Cheetos because you're freaking hungry, or you're obsessed with Cheetos, which Thomas Aquinas may have been obsessed with Cheetos, but I'm not entirely sure about that. So don't quote me on it. So human law, teleology. I want the freaking Cheetos and I'm going to get those suckers no matter what. Okay. But human law says I can't steal to get those Cheetos. No matter what my end is, I am not allowed to be a bad person to get the Cheetos. I have to follow human law. And the reason for human law is we have got to understand God's law on our own time and in our own ways and in our own places. Based on culture, based on history and government and all of the things that come into being human, we have created human law. So that way we can't fall short of all of these laws. So, but law is always directed, in theory, I know I'm going to get all these people saying this is a bad law and this is a bad law and this is yes, there are laws that suck, I agree. But when people make the law, they made the law hopefully so that it would feed into the common good. So human law is aimed towards completing the common good and towards our purpose of living good lives together, right? We've talked about this before, folks, living good lives together. So virtue for Thomas is necessary for the common good, and human laws then become the instruments of proper virtue. So this is all in agreement. Aristotle laid down a lot of this, and Thomas would have talked about it with Albertus Magnus. And I guess you guys can all reason through what human law is. Oh, so what about natural law? Ugh. It is like the worst, most misunderstood of Thomas's treatise on law. So to truly define human law, somebody that reads Aquinas has to refer to the natural law in necessity. There's no way to have human law without having natural law. And when I was talking before, there seems to be a gap, right, between the eternal law and the divine law and human law. And how do we get from divine law to human law? The natural law. It's the missing part in between. But the natural law has precepts, it has beginnings and roots that are really difficult to understand and pinpoint. And so it gets hijacked. We're hijacking again. We're hijacking a lot of things today. It gets hijacked in a really bad way sometimes and becomes the reason for doing something or not doing something. So the natural law is law that has moral content, but that's more general than human law. So I might say I absolutely am not allowed to go rob the 7-Eleven of all of their Cheetos, because who can eat just one bag? I mean, those are tasty. I'm not sure if you guys like the really spicy Cheetos, but the plain Cheetos, they're pretty awesome. So I can't go take all of the Cheetos, right? I can't go take all of the Cheetos. And honestly, if there were pretzels, I'd probably take the pretzels before the Cheetos. But the natural law is going to say, I don't care about your 7-Eleven. I don't care about your Cheetos or your pretzels. That's such human BS. Don't steal any shit. Don't steal it. Don't steal. Don't take anything. God said don't take anything that's not yours. Don't do it. Okay, so we're becoming more general. And the greatest number one purpose of the natural law holds that in general, human life should be preserved at any cost. And steps have to be actively taken to preserve human life. So, this is problematic, because then you say wars. Right. But Catholicism later developed a proportionality theory that allows us to go to war, and because you're looking at the greater good versus lesser good, and we're not going to get into that today. But basically, if you're interested, it's called just war theory, and that is based on Aquinas's uses of the law, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. But, specific human laws governing things are governed in time. In ancient Rome, you might have had people running after chariots to give out tickets. But today, we have automobiles. So human law has to change, while natural law is supposed to be so general that it can be any time and any place in human history. And so we have to be very careful with using the natural law. Thomas Aquinas, I know for those of you in theology, you'll probably hear this, and it is a little bit cliched now to me, but still holds true. Being a scientist, Thomas would have wanted to use the best science that he could find. So any of his precepts that he wrote are by and large based on what he knew and the information in science that he could get a hold of at the point that he was writing this. So if you could imagine back, the law, the human law that Thomas would create based on natural law would be very different from what we would be doing and what we would be using today in terms of law. It's a law that you have to be very, very particular about. But the basis of it is, for Thomas Aquinas, all things are supposed to be grasped and done with rationality. We're supposed to use reason, which comes from our free will that God gave us. And I like Thomas, and I've always liked Thomas more than Augustine. Poor Augustine. But I do like Thomas because Thomas was always really hopeful. Thomas sincerely believed that everybody is oriented toward the good, and that if we could just put our selfish habits and vices aside, because he felt that was always what got in our way, was our bad habits, our vices, our addictions, our gluttony. And if we could put all that aside, we could actually get done what we're supposed to do, which is give our lives toward the good in moral virtue under God's law. And I don't think, he would have been particularly bent on whether or not somebody was Catholic even, as long as they were aimed and doing what he felt was good. So, lesson of today. If you're reading Thomas's treatise on law, which I would recommend for anybody to do because it is certainly quite amazing, there's a lot of good information there. But be careful to watch the time that Thomas was writing in, and keep him oriented to his own place in history. Don't take him out of history just to conveniently use him on your own timeline. So that's kind of all I have on Thomas. I mean, we could go on about Thomas forever, but certainly that's probably one of the most important sections for somebody like me, my Cheeto pretzel loving self. Y'all, don't go rob stores. Like, moral of the story today, don't go rob anything. That's just wrong. It's jank. I'll buy you some Cheetos.
Certainly, if you're going to rob something, please, don't embarrass yourself at the 7-Eleven, right? Aim a little higher, please.
There's cameras, people. You're going to get arrested.
Yeah.
Also,
Speaking of cameras.
Podcast? What?
What's that?
What? Cameras?
Speaking of cameras, no one listening can see this, but Christine's hair looks really good.
Oh, Seth. Because I finally pulled it out at work. I hate the feeling of hair touching my neck or my face, so I put it back in a ponytail so that I can actually concentrate without being driven insane. But I came home, and then having it in a ponytail was driving me nuts while we were recording. So I pulled it out and ran my finger, and it was like one of those shampoo commercials, and shook it out and impressed Seth.
Yeah, it was. I remembered what I was gonna say before Erica reminded me, is that Thomas has this really kind of cool trust in human nature, which is kind of different than Augustine's view of human nature. So Thomas believes that human capability can take humans to a certain high degree, but that grace is needed to perfect that nature. So humans can learn a lot of things through science and can understand our natural world because of our intellects, but grace needs to intervene to get us to understanding of God.
Interesting, because that's almost exactly what the alchemists teach. So of course, since I come to Albertus via alchemy, alchemy is not about turning physical lead into physical gold, though that is said to be, quote, possible. The lead and the gold is very analogous, since we've been using that term. And it's about improving the state of one's soul. And Flamel, Nicholas Flamel, who some of you might know from the Harry Potter books, but he was an actual guy. He writes very explicitly about this, and about you can go so far in your purification and advancement, but the final, and specifically toward attaining the Philosopher's Stone, that final step is grace. There's always an element of grace involved. So I found it really interesting that Thomas has very much the same idea, that humans can go a long way in their own efforts, but there's never complete without grace.
And he was big on prayer too. So, if
ora et labora.
In order to work to perfecting the soul, I don't think he'd say prayer was the only thing you needed, but I think he would say in order to conquer these habits and vices and, aim your soul toward the good, prayer had to be a part of it.
We're going to have to do an alchemy episode because everything that's being said, I'm like, yeah, I dig it because that's totally what I was.
Every time you say silver and gold, in my head I start singing that stupid song from Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. And so, slightly disturbed by it because it's not going anywhere.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to bring up, so again, I'm glad that both of you were able to speak on Thomas like this. And especially thank you, Erica, for explaining the 4 types of law and specifically natural law, because I see it invoked all over the place, but I've never seen it really defined. And the closest I was able to get was, it's the law that you can divine by observing nature. But then I was always like, what is that fallen nature? Because all we can observe is nature post the fall, in which case we're not observing any law that God put in place. We're looking at the results, maybe what God put in place, but then warped or stained or wounded by what humans, our ancestors, Adam and Eve, did.
Okay, so part of that is, Aquinas has what's called the Great Chain of Being. God is on the top, angels are next, and then there's a huge freaking gap, and then humans are somewhere in there. And then it's other sentient beings. So for those of you who don't know, beings that have some sort of reason, and but not human reason. And then sense reason. So they use all their senses. And then non-sentient beings, plants and amoeba and whatnot. But so the natural law, yes. So I growled because I have heard that so much, and it's just not entirely accurate. So the thought was at one point, and I chalk it up to those neo-Thomists, you lot. The thought at one point was that, okay, well, we could look at nature to glean from the, like you say, non-fallen animals what we should ultimately be doing. But I go back to science at that point, and looking at animals and animal husbandry was a lot different than what we know today. There are monkeys that have gay relationships, not to procreate, but for other purposes.
Bonobos.
Yes, bonobos. So what they saw back then does not equate to what we see now. And if we keep using it as our scientific reason, that's just not what Thomas wanted. That's not what Thomas wanted at all. So, Great Chain of Being is fine, but it has a place. And I think Thomas would be coming after people and breaking their robots if he knew that they were behaving so badly.
Well, and it's, I don't think anyone's arguing necessarily that humans should act like bonobos because they've got their own problems. God knows. And it takes, you've really got to, part of my argument was no matter where you fall on any issue, if you're pulling in, what science says back then or even now, you have to have a huge understanding of, you can't just say that, bonobos have these non-procreative relationships without going into the social structure of bonobo populations and what that means for bonobos versus chimpanzees and how these things, understanding all of that. Well, most theologians aren't going to be going into all of that. For instance, I've never seen any theologian reference even the general idea of RK theory, which talks about, in general, sort of mating strategies between species and what that means. So for me, it's, and that's always also assuming that even if you're using the most up-to-date science, that your science actually fully understands whatever you're talking about. And that's something that, like, I just know how much in the past century, astrophysics and to a certain extent physics in general has gone off the edge. It's not been anything to do with actual science. It's been, mathematical fantasies. So if you're going to rely, the concept of observing nature, that'll give us natural law, and then we're going to be able to lock that in place and make doctrine off of it, and that will then beat other people over the head with. You have these steps that it starts, and each misstep just becomes worse and worse and worse. And I'm all about learning about God from nature. I am totally in favor of that, because ultimately everything that we can see is a part of nature. That is God's work. That is one of the ways that God talks to us and expresses God's self in front of us. But it gets really shaky if you're going to start saying that what we know about nature at this point, that then becomes natural law, which becomes how we know what humans are supposed to do. Because humans aren't bonobos, humans aren't chimpanzees, humans aren't dogs or wolves or anything else. And we have
a hard time admitting to what we don't know.
Yes.
So really, when we make laws, the reason he says that human life is what natural law is mostly based on is because it's the only thing through the centuries that we have all felt is what God wanted for us, was life, the right for people to live. And so I think for Thomas, it's a retreat away from having to posit anything specific to the natural law, because I don't think he believed it belonged there.
And I think that's wisdom. Like, that right there is the difference between knowledge and wisdom, is that he understood what he didn't know, and he just went right to the core of it instead of trying to make all these specifics. The other thing that has sometimes bothered me, and I guess maybe if I get introspective, perhaps I have a bit of resentment, not against Aquinas personally, but one thing I see a lot of, I'm going to use my phrase, the pop theologians, the YouTube theologians, yes, I'll name names if you ask me, who behave as though Thomas were the sum and totality of Catholic tradition. And I will absolutely grant and promote him as foundational, as an absolute, I think one of you said before, he was a watershed moment. You cannot understand, not just Catholic, you can't understand Western civilization and Western thinking without him. But he's not the sum and totality of Catholic tradition or Western civilization. He's closer in time to us than he was to Jesus. And so while he's very important, he's not everything. And if anyone tries to tell you all you need to know is Aquinas is a good start, but you're going to miss out on a lot if all you do is study Aquinas. And you're going to have, I don't want to say uneven or narrow, because those are really terrible. I would never apply those to Aquinas himself, but you're going to have a very incomplete understanding of Catholic tradition and Catholic teaching.
Well, and because, Aquinas would hate that position himself. Like, he brings in everything.
Yeah.
The whole fact that, Albertus and Alexander of Hales were working with Aristotle, but at the time that Aquinas was using Aristotle, it was still very like cutting edge and kind of controversial for him to use that.
In fact, after he died, unfortunately, he died before his teacher did. Albertus actually had to go defend him and say that the Summa, his writing, and that he was in fact orthodox. Like, that's how impactful, even immediately, it was that it was controversial. And the fact that, Seth, you mentioned that he wrote that as an introductory text. It was never supposed to be the everything every Christian needs to know about God and the world. It was supposed to be, this is a really good place to start. And I think that really gets lost.
Well, and before, you brought up Avicenna and Averroes, and I teach them in my Christian thought class.
Yeah, they were really, I've read some of Avicenna. Good stuff.
They were in part, like you were talking about with Albertus Magnus, on their side, in the Eastern world, they were responsible for translating Aristotle and bringing it to their people. So you have a lot of people that were working in different ways to have this full body of Christian thought. I make my kids, they're not kids, they're adults people, but I call them my kids. I used to make my kids go through all of the different theologians that had proofs of God, because there's not just one. So we would go through the different ones, and Averroes and Avicenna had proofs of God. And they were so much like our Christian proofs of God. It was fascinating for them to read them side by side, to see how philosophically we come to the same conclusion that God is present. So there is. Aquinas is amazing. He's certainly one of my favorites. He's near and dear to my heart. But folks, there's a lot in the world of Christian theology, non-Christian theology, that will certainly fit your fancy. There's something for everybody, from mysticism to something more legalistic like Aquinas' treatise on law. And, hopefully we can bring that to you over the course of time through these podcasts. So basically what I'm saying is that you need to stay with us. We don't handle rejection very well. We're three people that want to be friends with you, so please stay with us. Was that creepy? Was that a little? Was that too stalkerish?
We want to be
I think
friends
that's what
with
I wrote
you.
in my Tinder profile.
Come play with us. Come play with us.
Oh my God. Okay. What Seth didn't tell you is that I actually look like I'm going to rob a 7-Eleven because I'm so cold. I've been hiding in my hoodie the entire time. Oh, imagery.
Yeah.
All right. Well, folks, I think that's it for this week. So we're glad that you joined us. Definitely, again, tell your friends about us if you enjoy listening to us. We hope that we have brought you some interesting thoughts on Thomas Aquinas. And join us next week. We are going to do Catholic Stories of the Weird, Creepy Catholicism. It's going to be a lot of fun. So we're each going to come with some stories, and I don't think you want to miss that episode.
No, you definitely don't.
You don't. So until next week, we will see you later.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.